The last voice message. Of all the stories I've told on this channel, this one is probably one of the most unsettling, not because it's graphic, but because of how ordinary it begins, and how wrong it becomes by the end. There are no disturbing images in this story, no gore, nothing like that. But there is one detail near the end that stayed with me for a long time after I first heard it. So, viewer discretion is advised. And with that said, let's get into it. In the spring of 2017, a 3-4-year-old man named Daniel Mercer was living what most people would call a very normal life. He lived in a quiet town in Oregon, worked as an independent surveyor, and spent most of his time driving long rural roads, mapping land boundaries for construction companies, logging terrain, and dealing with property disputes that usually came down to fences, trees, and inches of dirt. Daniel was not the kind of guy people worried about. He was careful, routine-driven. He called his mother every Sunday, texted his younger sister almost every day, and had the kind of habits that made him easy to notice if something changed. He also had one specific ritual he never skipped. Anytime he had to drive out to a remote job site alone, he would text one person before leaving and one person when he got back. Always. Usually it was his sister, Emily. And if the place was far enough out, he'd also leave her a voicemail with the route he was taking, just in case he lost signal along the way. At the time, nobody thought much of this habit. It just seemed like Daniel being Daniel. A little too careful, maybe. A little too organized. But in hindsight, that habit is the only reason anyone knew where to start looking. On Thursday, April 13th, Daniel had a survey assignment on a piece of private land just outside a timber area, about 2 hours from town. The property had recently been purchased by a buyer from out of state, and the county needed updated markers before the boundary could be transferred. It was supposed to be a simple one-day job. Drive out, hike in, confirm the corners, come back. At 7:12 that morning, Daniel texted Emily. He said, "Headed out now. Probably bad signal up there. I'll call when I'm back on the road." That was normal. At 8:03, he left her a voicemail. And that was normal too. The voicemail was calm, routine, almost boring. He gave the route number, mentioned a logging road he'd be using, joked that his truck still smelled like gas station coffee, and said if he wasn't back by dark, she had permission to call and annoy him. Then he laughed. That was the last normal thing anyone heard from him, because Daniel never came home. At first, nobody panicked. Emily texted him around 6 p.m. No answer. She called around 7:30. Straight to voicemail. That was strange, but not alarming yet. Remote area, bad signal, long day. By 10 p.m., she called again. Still nothing. At midnight, she called their mother, and by sunrise the next morning, both of them were sitting in the county sheriff's office filing a missing person report. Now, at first, the sheriff's department treated it the way they treat a lot of adult disappearances. A grown man didn't check in. It happens. Maybe he stayed somewhere overnight. Maybe the truck broke down. Maybe the phone died. They took the report seriously, but not urgently. That changed around noon, because a deputy called Emily back and asked a very specific question. "Did your brother usually leave long voicemails?" Emily said yes. The deputy asked if she still had the one from yesterday. She did, and when she played it back for him over the phone, he asked her to stop it, right at the end. Not the normal part. Not the root. Not the joke. Not Daniel's voice. The sound after the laugh. Emily hadn't noticed it before. Most people wouldn't have, because it was quiet, barely there. But once the deputy heard it, he couldn't unhear it. It sounded like someone else, exhaling. Not Daniel, not a phone glitch. A second breath, very close to the microphone. That was when the search changed. Deputies went out along Daniel's route that afternoon and found his truck before sunset. It was parked on the shoulder of an old service road, nose pointed toward the trees, driver's door closed, keys gone. There were no signs of a crash, no blood, no shattered glass, nothing dramatic. It looked almost staged in how ordinary it seemed. His phone charger was still plugged into the dash. A half-finished bottle of water sat in the cup holder, and on the passenger seat was his field notebook. Open. One page had been torn out. The deputies searched the area immediately. By dark, they found his survey pack about a quarter-mile from the truck. Then one boot. Then, farther uphill, one orange ribbon marker tied to a branch. But no Daniel. The dogs lost his trail near a clearing at the edge of the timber line. And according to the handlers, that almost never happened that cleanly unless one of two things was true. Either the person had gotten into another vehicle, or they had gone somewhere the dogs could not reach. The weather turned bad that night, and by the next morning the story had spread beyond the county. A local station ran a short segment, "Surveyor missing in remote timber area." Then a regional channel picked it up. Then people started calling in. Most of the tips were useless. Somebody saw a truck. Somebody heard shouting. Somebody knew the landowner's cousin and thought the property was cursed. That kind of thing. But one call mattered. A man who worked maintenance for a communications tower about 9 miles away said that late Thursday morning, he had passed a dark green pickup heading the opposite direction on a narrow gravel road that almost nobody used anymore. He remembered it because Daniel's truck had been parked awkwardly near a turnout, and he had slowed down to make room. He said the driver of the pickup kept his head down and didn't wave. There was also, according to him, something white in the back seat. At the time, he assumed it was a rolled tarp. Now he wasn't so sure. That tip gave investigators something solid for the first time. Not much, but enough. They pulled traffic cameras from the nearest highway connector. They checked registration databases for green pickups in the county. They interviewed a dozen landowners and timber contractors, and within 48 hours, one name started rising to the surface. A man named Curtis Vale. Curtis lived alone in a rented trailer outside the nearest mill town. He was 42, had no stable employment, and had been cited over the years for trespassing, dumping on private land, and threatening county workers during property line disputes. Nothing major. Nothing that made him a clear suspect on its own. But when investigators went through old complaint records, they found something that bothered them. Daniel had met Curtis once before, 6 months earlier, on another survey job. The report from that day said Curtis had accused Daniel of moving lines that weren't his to move and had told him, in front of 2 witnesses, that people who went looking for boundaries out there sometimes found the wrong thing. At the time, it sounded like rural tough guy nonsense. Now it sounded different. Investigators brought Curtis in for questioning. He denied everything. Said he hadn't been near that road in weeks. Said he didn't know Daniel beyond some county guy. Said people were trying to frame him because he complained too much. But then the detectives asked him about the voicemail. They didn't tell him what was on it. They only said they had the last recording Daniel made before he disappeared. And according to one of the detectives later, Curtis changed immediately. Not visibly panicked, just quieter, more careful. That was enough for them to go looking harder. 3 days later, they found Daniel's handheld GPS unit in a burn barrel behind Curtis's trailer. It wasn't completely destroyed, and that turned out to be the break in the case, because the device still had part of Daniel's last route saved. When techs recovered the data, they found something strange. Daniel had not walked in a straight survey path like he normally would have. At one point, his track line stopped making sense. It zigzagged, paused, turned sharply, moved in short bursts like he was changing direction quickly, then stopped entirely near an old access road that did not belong to the survey property at all. That suggested he had either gotten disoriented, or he had been following someone. Police went back to that access road with cadaver dogs. And about 70 yards down from the last GPS point, they found a depression hidden under slash and cut branches. Not deep, not professional, just enough to conceal something in a hurry. Daniel's body was there. He hadn't wandered off. He hadn't fallen. And he hadn't been taken far. He had been killed within a mile of his own truck. When investigators confronted Curtis with that discovery, he still denied involvement. For another full day, he said nothing useful. And then, strangely, he asked for a lawyer, but not before making one statement that changed the whole way the case was understood. He said, "You're looking in the wrong hour." At first, nobody understood what he meant. Then, one investigator went back to the voicemail, the final one, the one Emily had saved, and they listened to it again, not once, not twice, over and over. Daniel's voice was calm all the way through. Normal route, normal joke, normal laugh. Then the second breath, and right after that, almost too low to hear, Daniel says one more thing, not to Emily, to someone else. He says, "I thought you left." That one sentence changed everything, because it meant whoever was near him when he made that voicemail wasn't a stranger he had just encountered. It was someone he believed had already gone. Someone who had been there, then disappeared, then come back close enough to breathe into the phone. The theory investigators built from there was chillingly simple. Curtis had approached Daniel on the property that morning, angry about the landlines again. They argued. Curtis left, or pretended to. Daniel, thinking the confrontation was over, called Emily and left the route message. But Curtis had not gone. He was standing nearby while Daniel recorded it, listening, waiting. Then, sometime after the voicemail ended, he confronted Daniel a second time. This time it turned violent. The torn page from the field notebook was never recovered, but investigators believed Daniel had written something down, maybe a plate number, maybe a name, maybe a direction Curtis drove off in after the first confrontation. Whatever it was, Curtis removed it. At trial, prosecutors didn't have a confession. They didn't need one. They had the prior threat, the false statements, the burned GPS, the truck sighting, the recovery site, and above all, that voicemail. That final, ordinary-sounding voicemail that became horrifying only when people understood what was really happening in it. Curtis was convicted of murder and sentenced to life. And even after the case was closed, Emily said the voicemail was the one thing she could never bring herself to delete. Not because she wanted to hear the last proof, but because for almost a full day after Daniel vanished, she had already been carrying the answer in her pocket. She just didn't know it yet. And honestly, that might be the part of this story that bothers me most. Not the violence, not the burial site, not even the trial. It's the idea that the moment everything changed was already there, preserved perfectly, hidden in something that sounded normal. A laugh, a breath, one extra sentence. That's all it took. Because sometimes the scariest thing in a story is not the part where someone disappears. It's the part where, if you listen closely enough, you can hear that they already knew they were no longer alone.